March 15, 1985. The Rambo set in Acapulco was 110 degrees. Producer Frank Marchetti had humiliated bigger stars than Sylvester Stallone. 200 cast and crew members watched as Frank tore into Stallone for 20 minutes straight, calling him a washed-up meathead and Rocky's lucky accident. Then Stallone smiled, not the angry smile actors fake for cameras. The smile of a man who's been waiting for this exact moment. The smile of someone who knows something you don't. Frank thought he'd won. He thought he'd put another actor in his place. But Stallone reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope, thick, heavy, Frank's name written across the front. "Frank," Stallone said quietly, "I think you should see what's inside." What happened next didn't just destroy Frank Marchetti's career. It brought down half of Hollywood's power structure, all because a producer thought he could humiliate the wrong man. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Frank's hand trembled as he reached for the envelope. The Mexican sun beat down mercilessly on the Rambo set, but the chill running through his spine had nothing to do with temperature. 200 pairs of eyes watched the exchange. Crew members who'd seen Frank destroy careers with less provocation, actors who'd learned to cower when his voice rose above a whisper. But Stallone wasn't cowering. He stood there, sweat-stained and calm, holding the envelope like a loaded weapon. "What the hell is this?" Frank's voice cracked slightly, betraying the first hint of uncertainty he'd shown in decades of ruling Hollywood through fear. 20 years of homework, Stallone replied, his voice barely audible over the distant crash of Acapulco waves. "Open it." The set had gone silent except for the hum of camera equipment and the nervous shuffling of feet. Frank's fingers worked at the envelope's clasp, his movements awkward under the weight of so many stares. He'd built his reputation on public humiliation, making examples of people who dared challenge his authority. The irony wasn't lost on him that his own judgment might come in front of the largest audience he'd ever commanded. Inside the envelope were photographs, black and white, crystal clear. Frank's face drained of color as he flipped through them. Images of him with underage actresses at his Malibu parties, handwritten contracts with illegal clauses, bank statements showing money laundered through shell companies. Each photograph was dated, time-stamped, notarized. "Where did you get these?" Frank's voice was a whisper now, all his theatrical bluster evaporated. "I've been collecting them since 1965, Stallone said. "Every party, every backroom deal, every time you thought nobody was watching." He stepped closer, and Frank caught the scent of the actor's determination. Raw, focused, 20 years in the making. "You made one mistake, Frank. You thought I was just another actor." The crew members nearest to Frank began to step back, sensing the shift in power like animals before an earthquake. Camera operators lowered their equipment. Script supervisors closed their notebooks. Even the Mexican extras who understood little English felt the electricity in the air. Frank tried to regain his footing. "You think you can threaten me? I own this town, Stallone. I made careers and I've destroyed them. You're nothing without you?" Stallone laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Frank, I haven't needed you since Rocky. But you've needed me to stay quiet about what I know." He gestured to the envelope. "That's just the preview. I have boxes of evidence, testimony from dozens of victims, financial records going back to the Carter administration." The truth hit Frank like a physical blow. Every meeting, every party, every casual conversation, Stallone had been watching, documenting, waiting. The actor hadn't been building a career, he'd been building a case. "What do you want?" Frank asked. Though he already knew the answer wouldn't be money or roles or the usual Hollywood currency of favors and fear. "Justice," Stallone said simply. "And for you to understand that the game you've been playing has rules you never learned." He took the envelope back from Frank's shaking hands. "See, you thought power meant making people afraid of you. But real power is making someone powerful afraid of what they've done." Frank looked around the set, seeing it clearly for the first time. These weren't just employees and contractors, they were witnesses. Stallone hadn't chosen this moment randomly. He'd orchestrated it, turning Frank's own weapon of public humiliation against him. "The FBI gets copies of everything tomorrow morning," Stallone continued conversationally, as if discussing the weather. "Along with the IRS, the California Attorney General's office, and editors at the Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, and Variety." He paused, letting the implications sink in. "Unless, of course, you'd prefer to make this easy." Frank's legs felt weak. 30 years of building an empire, of accumulating power and wealth through intimidation and blackmail, and it was all crumbling because he'd chosen the wrong target for his cruelty. He'd humiliated Stallone expecting submission, never realizing the actor had been preparing for this war since before Frank had even noticed him. "You can't prove any of this," Frank said weakly, grasping for any lifeline. Stallone smiled again, that same knowing expression that had started this nightmare. "Frank, I've been in this business long enough to know that in Hollywood, you don't need proof, you just need a good story." He gestured to the crowd of onlookers, many now holding their own cameras, capturing every moment. "And this is going to be a hell of a story." The sun beat down mercilessly as Frank Marchetti realized his reign of terror was over, not because of a scandal or a box office bomb or a corporate takeover, but because he'd finally met someone who'd been playing a longer game than his own. The revolution had begun with a smile and an envelope. By tomorrow, it would reshape Hollywood forever. The silence stretched across the set like a held breath. Frank Marchetti stood frozen in the aftermath of his own destruction, watching Sylvester Stallone walk away with the casual confidence of a man who'd just rearranged the universe. The envelope, that damned envelope, disappeared into the actor's trailer, taking with it 30 years of carefully constructed power. But it was the faces surrounding Frank that truly drove the knife home. 200 people who'd witnessed his humiliation weren't just crew members and extras anymore. They were the first audience to a story that would echo through every studio lot, every executive dining room, every back alley deal in Hollywood. The Mexican heat pressed down on them all, but Frank felt cold, utterly cold. Behind the facade of the legendary producer, behind the carefully cultivated image of the man who could make or break careers with a phone call, Frank Marchetti was something much simpler, a frightened 60-year-old who'd built his life on other people's fear, only to discover that fear was a currency that could be devalued overnight. The irony wasn't lost on him that his empire had begun with a similar moment of vulnerability, though he'd been on the other side of it then. 1955, a cramped office in Burbank, where a nervous young assistant had handed him a file on a rival producer's financial irregularities. Frank had been nobody then, just another hungry kid from Brooklyn who'd clawed his way into the periphery of the dream factory. But he'd understood something that day about power that had served him for 3 decades. Information was leverage, and leverage was everything. Now, as the Mexican crew began to dismantle the morning's shot, their movements careful and deliberate around the explosive tension still crackling in the air, Frank realized how thoroughly Stallone had outmaneuvered him. The actor hadn't just been collecting evidence, he'd been studying Frank's own playbook, learning the very techniques that had built the Marchetti empire, then turning them into weapons of surgical precision. Frank's mind raced through the implications. The FBI would move first. They always did when financial crimes were involved. The photographs alone would trigger a federal investigation that would tear through his production companies like wildfire. The IRS would freeze his assets. The California Attorney General would probably convene a grand jury. And the press would feast on this for months. But it was the personal cost that made his chest tighten with something approaching panic. His wife, Maria, wouldn't survive the scandal. 35 years of marriage to a woman who genuinely believed she'd married a man who brought dreams to life, not nightmares. She'd stood by him through the lean years, the brutal 18-hour days, the constant pressure of an industry that devoured souls for breakfast. The revelation of what he'd really been doing all these years would destroy her. And then there was his daughter, Catherine, 28, and just starting her own career as a documentary filmmaker. She'd inherited his eye for story and his drive for perfection, but none of his cruelty. The knowledge that her father had built his success on the broken dreams and violated trust of vulnerable young actresses would kill something essential in her. Frank had seen it happen to other industry children. the moment they realized their privileged lives had been paid for with other people's suffering. The worst part was that he genuinely convinced himself over the years that he was protecting them from the ugliness of Hollywood. He'd compartmentalized his business practices so completely that he could come home to his Bel Air mansion, kiss Maria on the forehead, ask Catherine about her latest project, and feel like a loving husband and father. The cognitive dissonance had become so natural he'd forgotten it was a lie. Now, watching the crew avoid his eyes as they packed equipment, Frank felt the full weight of what he'd built and what he was about to lose. The Marchetti name had meant something in this town. Respect, fear, guaranteed box office returns. By tomorrow morning, it would mean scandal, corruption, the cautionary tale every film school would teach about the dangers of unchecked power. Stallone emerged from his trailer, having changed out of his Rambo costume into simple jeans and a white t-shirt. He moved with the easy grace of a man who just set down a burden he'd been carrying for 20 years. As he passed Frank, he paused, close enough that only the producer could hear his words. "You want to know the difference between us, Frank?" Stallone's voice was quiet, almost gentle. "You built your power on what people were afraid you'd take from them. I built mine on what I was willing to give up to do what's right." Frank opened his mouth to respond, but found he had no words. What could he say? That he was sorry? That he'd change? That 3 decades of systematic abuse and manipulation had all been some terrible misunderstanding? Stallone didn't wait for an answer. He walked toward the waiting car that would take him back to the hotel, leaving Frank alone in the center of a set that suddenly felt like a crime scene. The revolution had indeed begun with a smile and an envelope. But Frank was only now beginning to understand that his war with Stallone would reshape more than Hollywood. It would expose what he truly was beneath 30 years of carefully constructed lies. Frank stood motionless as Stallone's car disappeared into the dusty haze of the Mexican afternoon, the engine's rumble fading into the distant sounds of Acapulco traffic. The set around him continued its methodical breakdown, grips coiling cables, gaffers dismantling lights, everyone moving with the practiced efficiency of a crew that had witnessed something they'd pretend not to remember. His legs finally remembered how to move. Frank stumbled toward his own trailer, needing walls around him, needing a moment to think without 200 pairs of eyes cataloging his every expression. Inside the air-conditioned sanctuary, he collapsed into the leather chair behind his makeshift desk and reached for the phone with trembling fingers. He had to warn Maria, had to prepare Catherine, had to... The phone rang before he could lift the receiver. Frank stared at it, his hand frozen halfway to the handset. Nobody had this number except his inner circle. The ring seemed to echo in the confined space, sharp and insistent. On the 3rd ring he answered, "Frank Marchetti." "Hello, Frank." The voice hit him like ice water in his veins. 30 years collapsed in an instant, and suddenly he was 28 again, standing in a Paramount conference room, watching his mentor's world explode around him. Vincent. The name came out as barely a whisper. "You sound surprised. After what just happened out there, I figured you'd be expecting my call." Vincent Torino, the man who'd taught Frank everything about power, about leverage, about turning Hollywood's darkest impulses into profit. The man who'd vanished from the industry in 1965 after a scandal that had buried 3 careers and sent 2 executives to federal prison. The man Frank had betrayed to save his own skin. "You're supposed to be dead," Frank managed. A laugh, dry as desert wind. "Dead to Hollywood, maybe. But I've been watching, Frank. All these years, I've been watching you use everything I taught you, watching you perfect the techniques I showed you. A pause, watching you become everything I was, but with less style and no exit strategy." Frank's mind reeled. If Vincent was alive, if he'd been watching, what do you want? Want? Frank, you misunderstand. This isn't about what I want. This is about what's already in motion. The voice carried the same cold authority Frank remembered from those long-ago meetings. "You think Stallone's revelation is your biggest problem? That envelope he showed you today, that's kindergarten compared to what's coming. I don't understand. 20 years ago, when you threw me to the wolves to save your own career, you made a fundamental error. You assumed I'd go quietly. You assumed I'd take the fall for our shared sins and disappear like a good little scapegoat." The temperature in Vincent's voice dropped another degree. "But you forgot something important about me, Frank. I don't lose. I just change the game." Frank's throat felt like sandpaper. What are you saying? I'm saying that every crime you've committed, every life you've destroyed, every dirty deal you've made, I have records. Better records than Stallone's little photo album. Financial documents, recorded conversations, witness statements. A complete accounting of the Marchetti Empire's foundation in fraud, blackmail, and abuse. The trailer walls seem to be closing in. That's impossible. You've been out of the business for 30 years. 30 years of watching you build an empire on the ashes of my reputation. Did you really think I'd let that stand forever? Vincent's voice carried a smile Frank couldn't see but could definitely hear. See, I've been playing a much longer game than you realized. Every contact you made, every alliance you forged, every enemy you created, I've been there in the shadows, collecting intelligence, building my own network. Frank felt the last foundation of his understanding crumble. You've been behind this, the investigation, Stallone's evidence. Stallone's been gathering his evidence independently. Admirable work, really, though limited in scope. But yes, I may have guided certain information his way, helped him understand the full extent of your operations, ensured he had the courage to act on what he knew. Why? The word came out broken, desperate. Why now? Because 30 years is long enough to watch you profit from my downfall. Because I'm 73 years old and tired of waiting for natural justice. And because... Vincent paused, and when he continued, his voice carried the weight of 3 decades of carefully nursed hatred. Because you need to understand that when you betray someone like me, the punishment doesn't come immediately. It comes when it will hurt the most. Frank's hands were shaking so violently he could barely hold the phone. Everything he'd believed about his rise to power, about his own cunning and ruthlessness, was revealing itself as illusion. He hadn't outmaneuvered the system. He'd been a pawn in someone else's much larger game. The FBI will have my files tomorrow morning, Vincent continued conversationally. Complete documentation of your crimes going back to 1955, financial records that will make the IRS investigation look like a gentle audit, and testimony from witnesses you thought were dead. The line went dead. Frank stared at the receiver, his reflection distorted in its black surface. 30 years of empire building, and he'd never realized he was dancing on puppet strings. The past hadn't just returned. It had been directing the show all along. Frank dropped the phone as if it had burst into flames. The receiver clattered against the trailer's metal floor, the dial tone buzzing like an angry wasp in the stifling air. His reflection stared back from the black window. A stranger's face, pale and hollow, stripped of the confident mask he'd worn for 3 decades. Vincent Torino was alive. Not just alive, but orchestrating Frank's destruction from the shadows, pulling strings Frank hadn't even known existed. The revelation rewrote everything he thought he understood about his own success, his own power, his own survival in an industry that devoured the weak. Frank's instinct was to fight back, to use the weapons that had served him for 30 years. Pick up the phone, call his lawyers, mobilize his network of favors and fear. But his hands wouldn't stop shaking long enough to dial, and a terrible clarity was settling over him. There was no network anymore. Vincent had been there first, had 30 years to poison every well, compromise every ally. A sharp knock on the trailer door made Frank jump. He wiped his palms on his pants, trying to reassemble some semblance of authority. "Come in." Tommy Rodriguez, his assistant director, stepped inside but didn't fully enter, hovering near the door like a man ready to bolt. Tommy had worked with Frank for 8 years, had seen him destroy careers and resurrect them with equal ease. But now the young man's eyes couldn't quite meet Frank's, and his usual confident demeanor had evaporated. "Mr. Marchetti, there's been developments." Frank forced his voice steady. "What kind of developments?" The hotel called. 3 FBI agents checked in an hour ago. They're asking questions about the production, about you specifically. Tommy's Adam's apple bobbed nervously. "And sir, my phone's been ringing. Reporters from Variety, Hollywood Reporter, even The Times. They're asking about your past projects, about financial irregularities, about—" "Get out!" Tommy didn't need to be told twice. The trailer door slammed shut, leaving Frank alone with his spiraling thoughts. The FBI was already here. Vincent hadn't been making idle threats. The machine was already in motion, grinding toward Frank with federal inevitability. He tried calling his lawyer, Harold Whitman, who'd protected him through countless crises over the years. The secretary's voice was crisp, professional, and absolutely final. "Mr. Whitman is unavailable and won't be taking your calls." Frank stared at the phone. Harold had represented him for 15 years, had been at his house for Christmas dinner, had called him uncle. The speed of the abandonment was breathtaking. He tried 3 more allies, studio executives who owed their careers to his influence. Each call met the same result: unavailable, in meetings out of the country. The Hollywood machine had already calculated the cost of association with Frank Marchetti, and the math was brutally simple. By the 4th rejection, Frank understood he was witnessing something he'd orchestrated countless times himself: the systematic isolation of a target. He'd perfected the technique, watched it destroy stronger men than him. Now he was experiencing it from the inside, feeling the walls close in with methodical precision. The trailer door burst open without warning. Frank spun, expecting FBI agents, but instead found Maria Elena Santos, the film's Mexican liaison. A woman in her 50s who'd navigated Hollywood politics with shrewd intelligence. She'd always treated Frank with respectful deference. Now her dark eyes burned with something between disgust and satisfaction. "The crew is talking, Signor Marchetti." Her accent made his name sound like a curse. 20 years I work in this business. 20 years I watch men like you. I stay quiet. I play the game. She stepped closer, and Frank caught the scent of her determination, raw, focused, lethal. But no more. "Maria Elena, whatever you think you know, I know enough." She pulled out a small recording device, its red light blinking steadily. "Every conversation in this trailer is recorded. Every phone call. Every threat you made to my girls when you thought nobody was listening." Her smile was sharp as broken glass. "Signor Stallone, he is not the only one who has been collecting evidence." Frank's world tilted sideways. Even here, even in Mexico, where he'd thought himself beyond reach, the net was closing around him. How many others had been watching, documenting, waiting for this moment? "The Mexican authorities, they are very interested in your activities here," Maria Elena continued conversationally. "Bribes to local officials, exploitation of our workers, threats against young women who refused your advances." She pocketed the recorder. "I think your problems are bigger than just the FBI, no?" She left him standing in the wreckage of his certainty. Through the trailer window, Frank watched the last of the equipment being loaded onto trucks. The set was disappearing, taking with it the last vestiges of his old life. His phone rang again. This time, Frank let it ring, understanding finally that every call would only bring more bad news. The hunters were circling, and he was completely, utterly alone. Frank sat in the mechanical silence of his trailer for 20 minutes after Maria Elena left, watching the Mexican sunset paint the walls orange and red. The colors reminded him of blood, of fire, of everything that was burning down around him. When he finally forced himself to move, his joints protested like an old man's, which, he realized with a start, he was. 58 years old and about to lose everything he'd spent his adult life building. The phone had stopped ringing. Somehow, that was worse than the constant interruptions. He pulled out his wallet and found the creased photograph tucked behind his driver's license. Maria and Catherine at Catherine's college graduation, both of them beaming with pride as she held her film degree. His girls, his family, the people who would pay the highest price for sins they'd never committed. Frank's hands trembled as he dialed his home number. It rang 4 times before Maria's warm voice answered. "Marchetti Residence. Maria, it's me." The pause stretched too long. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, careful, distant, like she was talking to a stranger. "Frank, I was wondering when you'd call. We need to talk." His stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "A reporter from the Los Angeles Times called an hour ago. She wanted my comment about some allegations involving your business practices. Something about FBI investigations and financial irregularities." Maria's voice was steady, but Frank could hear the tremor underneath. "I told her she had the wrong number. That my husband was a producer, not a criminal." "Maria, listen to me." Then Catherine called. She'd been contacted by someone from Entertainment Weekly asking about her father's history of sexual harassment in Hollywood. The words came out flat, emotionless, as if Maria was reading from a script. She was crying, Frank. My daughter was crying because some stranger called her to ask if her father was a predator. Frank's vision blurred. 35 years of marriage, and he could count on one hand the times he'd heard Maria cry. She was the strongest person he knew, had held their family together through the chaos of his career, the long absences, the brutal pressure of Hollywood life. The thought of her voice breaking, of Catherine sobbing over questions she couldn't answer. "I can explain everything," he said, knowing how hollow it sounded. "Can you?" Maria's voice cracked just slightly. "Can you explain why FBI agents called here looking for you? Can you explain why our lawyer won't return my calls? Can you explain why every news channel in LA is running stories about corruption in Hollywood and showing your photograph?" Frank closed his eyes. The machine wasn't just destroying him. It was systematically dismantling every relationship, every connection that gave his life meaning. Vincent had studied him for 30 years, had mapped every vulnerability, every pressure point that would cause maximum devastation. "Where are you staying tonight?" Maria asked. And the question hit him like a physical blow. "What?" "I need time to think, Frank, to process what's happening. Catherine is here with me. She's too upset to go back to her apartment. The reporters have been calling every 10 minutes. There are news vans parked outside our house." Her breathing was uneven now, the composure finally cracking. I need you to stay somewhere else tonight, please." Frank felt something fundamental tear inside his chest. His own wife, his anchor, his safe harbor in 3 decades of industry storms, was asking him not to come home. The house in Bel Air, with its perfect gardens and family photos and 35 years of shared memories, was no longer his sanctuary. "Maria, please don't do this. We can figure this out together. We always have." "No." Her voice hardened. "We figured out your career pressures together. We figured out financial stress together. We figured out family problems together." A pause. "We never figured out how to handle you being a monster together, because I never knew I'd married one." The line went dead. Frank stared at the phone until the numbers on its face blurred together. Outside, the last of the crew trucks was pulling away, leaving behind only tire tracks in the dust and the skeleton of a set that would never see completion. Mexico, his escape, his chance to maintain some illusion of control, had become just another crime scene in Vincent's methodical prosecution. He thought about Vincent's words, "The punishment doesn't come immediately. It comes when it will hurt the most." Frank was beginning to understand that Vincent hadn't just been collecting evidence of his crimes. He'd been studying his life, mapping his relationships, calculating exactly how to destroy not just his career, but his identity, his family, everything that made him human beneath the monster. The trailer door rattled in the wind. Soon, even this temporary shelter would be gone. Frank Marchetti was about to discover what it meant to have absolutely nothing left to lose. Frank sat in the gathering darkness, the phone still warm in his hands from Maria's final words. "I never knew I'd married one." The accusation echoed in the empty trailer, reshaping 35 years of marriage into something unrecognizable. But as the initial shock faded, something else began to emerge, a gnawing suspicion that had been building since Vincent's call. He pulled out his wallet again, but this time his fingers went to a different photograph. Older, more faded. Himself and Vincent at the 1964 Golden Globes, arms around each other's shoulders, both grinning at the camera like they owned the world. Which in many ways, they had. Frank stared at Vincent's face, trying to reconcile the mentor he remembered with the puppet master who just orchestrated his destruction. Vincent had been more than a boss. He'd been a father figure, a teacher who'd shown a hungry kid from Brooklyn how to navigate Hollywood's treacherous waters. When the scandal broke in 1965, Frank had been devastated, convinced he was saving what little he could from the wreckage. But looking at that photograph now, Frank noticed something he'd somehow missed for 30 years. Vincent's smile was too confident, too knowing. Even in 1964, with federal investigators circling his empire, Vincent had looked like a man holding all the cards. "You assumed I'd take the fall for our shared sins and disappear like a good little scapegoat." Frank's blood turned to ice as the pieces clicked into place. He lurched to the trailer's filing cabinet, pawing through documents with desperate urgency until he found what he was looking for: the original contracts from his early deals, the paperwork that had launched his career. His hands shook as he spread the yellowed pages across the table. There it was, hidden in the dense legal language he'd never fully understood at 28. Clauses that gave Vincent's shell companies permanent percentages of Frank's future earnings. Provisions that made Vincent a silent partner in every deal Frank had ever made. Terms that meant, "Jesus Christ," Frank whispered to the empty trailer. "I've been working for him this whole time." The revelation rewrote everything. Every success, every triumph, every moment of pride in building his empire, all of it had been feeding money back to the man who'd supposedly ruined his life. Frank hadn't betrayed Vincent in 1965. Vincent had orchestrated his own downfall, positioning Frank as the perfect frontman for an operation that would continue generating profits for decades. Frank thought about Maria's words on the phone, the careful way she'd phrased certain sentences. The reporters had been calling every 10 minutes, not since the story broke, every 10 minutes, like clockwork, and the way she'd mentioned Catherine's specific reaction, the exact questions she'd been asked. His wife's voice played back in his memory, and this time he heard what he'd been too panicked to notice before: the slight pause before certain words, the too perfect timing of her emotional breaks, the way she'd built to asking him not to come home, like she was following a script. Frank's hands went numb. Even Maria, sweet, loyal Maria who'd stood by him through everything, had been part of Vincent's game. How long had she been reporting back? How many intimate conversations had been recorded? How many family moments had been calculated moves in a chess game Frank hadn't even known he was playing? The trailer door opened, and Frank spun around expecting to see FBI agents. Instead, a young man in an expensive suit stepped inside, his movements crisp and confident despite his youth. Frank had never seen him before, but something about his eyes, cold, calculating, familiar, made his stomach clench. "Mr. Marchetti," the man said, extending his hand. "I'm David Torino, Vincent's grandson." Frank stared at the offered hand without taking it. Vincent's grandson. Another piece of the machine, probably planted in the industry years ago, building his own network of contacts and influence while Frank remained oblivious. David's smile was Vincent's smile, sharp and predatory. "My grandfather sent me to deliver a message. He wants you to understand that every person you thought you'd destroyed over the years, every career you ended, every dream you crushed, they've all been working for him, building toward this moment." "That's impossible," Frank said, but his voice cracked on the words. "Is it? Think about it, Mr. Marchetti. Every major decision you've made, every deal that seemed too good to be true, every enemy who disappeared just when they should have destroyed you." David's voice carried the same cold authority Frank remembered from Vincent. "You've been dancing to his tune for 30 years, and you never even heard the music." The arrogance that had sustained Frank through 3 decades of industry warfare finally cracked. He'd spent his whole career believing he was the predator, when all along he'd been the prey. "Why?" Frank whispered. David's smile widened. "Because he could." The words hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Frank felt 30 years of self-delusion crumble in an instant, leaving him staring at this young man who carried Vincent's genes and Vincent's cruelty with equal measure. Because he could, Frank repeated, tasting the bitter truth of it. Not for justice, not for revenge, simply because Vincent Torino had the power to orchestrate the rise and fall of a man's entire existence, and Frank had been chosen as his masterpiece. David moved further into the trailer, examining the sparse furnishings with the detached interest of someone appraising property he already owned. "You want to know the beautiful part? You did it to yourself. Every horrible thing you've done, every person you've destroyed, that was all you, Frank. My grandfather just provided opportunities." Frank's mind raced backward through decades of choices, each one now tainted with the possibility that it had been guided, manipulated, orchestrated. The young actress he'd blackballed after she refused his advances. Had Vincent arranged for her to cross his path? The competing producer whose career Frank had systematically dismantled, had that rivalry been manufactured? The financial shortcuts he'd taken, the ethical lines he'd crossed, the gradual transformation from hungry young dreamer into the monster Maria couldn't recognize. He studied you, David continued conversationally. 30 years of detailed psychological profiling. He knew you'd become exactly what you became, because men like you always do. Put a little power in weak hands, and they'll do terrible things all by themselves. I was never weak, Frank snarled, but even as the words left his mouth, he heard their hollowness. David laughed. Vincent's laugh. Cold and knowing. Weren't you? You betrayed your mentor for a chance at his empire. You built your career on fear because you were too insecure to inspire loyalty. You destroyed others because their success reminded you how fragile your own position really was. His eyes glittered with cruel amusement. My grandfather didn't make you weak, Frank. He just gave your weakness room to grow. Frank thought about Stallone's face during their confrontation earlier that day. Not shocked, not intimidated, but almost satisfied. Like a man who'd been waiting for exactly that moment. How long had the actor been planning his response? How long had he been in contact with Vincent? Stallone, Frank whispered. Among others. You really think he just happened to start documenting your crimes? You think he developed that moral conscience all by himself? David's smile widened. He's been feeding information to my grandfather for 15 years. Every party, every meeting, every time you thought you were alone with your victims, someone was watching, someone was recording. The scope of the betrayal was breathtaking. Frank tried to count how many people in his inner circle must have been compromised, how many trusted allies had actually been Vincent's agents. His assistant directors, his financial advisors, his security team. How deep did the infiltration go? Even my wife, Frank said, more to himself than to David. Especially your wife. Maria's been the most valuable asset of all. David pulled out his phone, scrolled through something, then held it out to Frank. Would you like to hear some of the recordings she's made over the years? Family dinners where you bragged about destroying careers? Bedroom conversations where you planned your next victim? She's been very thorough. Frank's legs gave out. He collapsed into his chair, the weight of absolute betrayal crushing down on him. 35 years of marriage, and it had all been performance. Every tender moment, every shared struggle, every time he'd confessed his fears or doubts to the woman he'd thought loved him unconditionally, all of it had been fed back to Vincent, analyzed, cataloged, weaponized. The children? He asked weakly. Catherine's clean. She genuinely loves you, which is why watching your destruction will be so devastating for her. That's the point, Frank. The people you actually care about will suffer the most, while the people you thought you could trust reveal themselves as strangers who never cared about you at all. Frank closed his eyes, trying to find some center of self that hadn't been corrupted by Vincent's manipulation. But there was nothing left. No relationship that was real, no achievement that was his own, no aspect of his identity that hadn't been carefully cultivated for Vincent's purposes. What happens now? He asked. David pocketed his phone and straightened his tie with casual efficiency. Now you get to experience what it feels like to be one of your victims. The FBI will arrest you tomorrow morning. The charges are extensive: fraud, racketeering, sexual assault, tax evasion. You'll spend the rest of your life in prison, watching from your cell as my grandfather's people take apart your empire piece by piece. He moved toward the door, then paused. Oh, and Frank? That final phone call with Maria? She wanted me to tell you she never loved you. Not once in 35 years. It was always just business. David left Frank alone with the ruins of his life. And for the first time in 30 years, Frank Marchetti began to understand what powerlessness felt like. Frank sat in the crushing silence for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. The trailer's thin walls seemed to be closing in, and every shadow felt pregnant with watchers, with cameras, with Vincent's omnipresent influence. But as the initial shock of David's revelations began to fade, something unexpected stirred within him. Not despair, but a cold, clarifying rage. He stood slowly, his legs steadier than they'd been moments before. Vincent had orchestrated everything, yes, had manipulated his choices, corrupted his relationships, turned his own family against him. But there was one thing the old man had miscalculated, one element he couldn't have accounted for after 30 years of careful planning. Frank Marchetti was still alive, and he still had one card left to play. Moving with purpose for the first time all day, Frank went to his briefcase and pulled out a small key he'd carried for 3 decades. From a hidden compartment in the trailer's floor, a modification he'd insisted on for all his location offices, he retrieved a metal strongbox that Vincent's people had apparently overlooked. Inside were documents Vincent didn't know existed. Insurance, Frank had always called it. A producer's survival instinct in an industry built on betrayal. Bank records showing Vincent's shell companies. Correspondence proving the old man had never truly disappeared, but had been pulling strings from the shadows all along. And most damaging of all, evidence of Vincent's current operation, his network of informants and manipulators that stretched far beyond Frank's organization. Frank had been gathering this information for years, not out of suspicion, but out of professional paranoia. Every producer worth his salt kept dirt on everyone, even people they thought were dead. Now that insurance policy would serve a different purpose entirely. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he'd memorized but never used. The direct line from Marcus Webb, the FBI agent who'd been investigating Hollywood corruption for the past 5 years. A man Vincent couldn't possibly own, because Webb had been transferred to Los Angeles from the Atlanta field office specifically to bring fresh eyes to the investigation. Webb, Agent Webb, this is Frank Marchetti. I believe you've been looking for me. A pause. Mr. Marchetti. Yes, we'd very much like to speak with you. Are you prepared to surrender yourself? I'm prepared to make a deal. But not for my freedom. I know that ship has sailed. For my daughter's protection, and for information that will give you something much bigger than one corrupt producer. Frank could hear Webb shifting, papers rustling. I'm listening. Vincent Torino isn't dead. He's been running the largest organized crime operation in Hollywood history for 30 years, and I have the proof. Names, dates, financial records, the whole network. Frank's voice grew stronger with each word, but I also know he's planning something bigger than just my destruction. This was a test run, Agent Webb, a rehearsal for taking down the entire legitimate power structure in Hollywood and replacing it with his own people. The silence stretched longer this time. When Webb spoke again, his voice carried a different quality, sharp, focused. What kind of proof? Frank opened the first folder. Wire transfers from 17 different production companies to shell corporations in the Cayman Islands, all bearing Vincent's real signature, not the forgeries from 1965. Communication logs showing coordination between supposedly independent studios, and surveillance footage of meetings that prove he's been operating openly for years under assumed names. Where are you now? Mexico. But that's going to change in about 10 minutes. Vincent's people know where I am, which means this location is compromised. I'm going to disappear, Agent Webb, but I'll resurface when you can guarantee my daughter's safety and immunity in exchange for my cooperation. Mr. Marchetti, I can't authorize. Then get someone who can. You have 12 hours before I call again. And Agent Webb? When you start digging into Vincent's current operation, look closely at David Torino. Vincent's grandson. He's been placed at CAA for the past 3 years, building relationships with A-list talent. Whatever Vincent is planning, it centers around controlling the next generation of Hollywood power players. Frank ended the call and immediately began destroying everything else in the trailer that could be traced back to him. The documents in the strongbox went into a waterproof case. Everything else, clothes, personal effects, anything that carried his fingerprints or DNA, went into a pile in the center of the small room. As he worked, Frank felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, the satisfaction of making a choice that was entirely his own. Vincent had manipulated him, used him, turned his life into an elaborate puppet show. But the puppet was about to cut his own strings. Frank doused the pile with lamp oil and struck a match. As flames consumed the last physical traces of his presence, he walked out into the Mexican night. Tomorrow, the FBI would find only ashes. Vincent would discover that his perfect plan had one fatal flaw. He'd underestimated the very weakness he'd spent 30 years cultivating. Frank Marchetti was about to become the most dangerous thing in the world, a man with nothing left to lose except the truth. The Arizona desert stretched endlessly in every direction, a landscape as barren and unforgiving as Frank Marchetti had become. 2 years had passed since that night in Mexico when he'd walked away from the burning trailer, and the man who emerged from the small adobe house each morning bore little resemblance to the Hollywood power broker who had once terrorized sound stages across 3 continents. Frank's hands, once soft from decades of executive privilege, were now calloused from honest work. He ran a small auto repair shop on the outskirts of Tucson, serving the truckers and travelers who drifted through this forgotten corner of America. The FBI had honored their agreement. His testimony had brought down Vincent Torino's entire network, exposing a corruption scandal that had rewritten Hollywood's power structure overnight. In exchange, Frank had been given a new identity, a modest witness protection stipend, and something he'd never expected to want: anonymity. The bell above his shop door chimed as the morning's first customer entered, a young woman with an old Honda that wheezed and rattled like Vincent's final breaths had in that federal courtroom 6 months ago. Frank looked up from his coffee and smiled, a genuine expression that still surprised him when he caught it in the mirror. "Morning. What can I do for you?" The woman, Maria, his mind whispered automatically. Though this Maria was 25 and honest-faced and nothing like the woman who had shared his bed while recording his confessions, explained about her transmission problems with the earnest worry of someone for whom a car repair bill represented genuine hardship. Frank quoted her a fair price, then quietly decided to charge her half that amount. It was a luxury Vincent's manipulations had never allowed him, the simple pleasure of unexpected kindness. As he worked under the Honda's hood, Frank's thoughts drifted to Catherine. His daughter had visited once since his relocation, a stilted, painful conversation where she'd struggled to reconcile the monster from the news with the father who had taught her to ride a bicycle. She was in therapy now, processing 30 years of lies and the knowledge that her childhood had been performed for an audience of federal informants. She might visit again someday, or she might not. Frank had learned to live with uncertainty. The real Maria, his former wife, had died in a car accident 8 months after Vincent's trial concluded. The FBI suspected suicide, though they could never prove it. Frank had felt nothing when Agent Webb delivered the news. That capacity for grief, for connection to people who had betrayed him, seemed to have burned away in that Mexican trailer along with his old clothes and his old life. But Catherine was different. Catherine had been innocent, and somewhere in the charred remains of Frank's conscience, the possibility of her forgiveness represented something like redemption. The Honda's transmission required a part Frank didn't have in stock, so he called his supplier in Phoenix, while the young woman waited on his porch, reading a paperback novel in the desert sun. The mundane normalcy of it struck him with unexpected force. No cameras, no ulterior motives, no one keeping score of favors owed or vengeance planned. Just a simple transaction between strangers who would likely never see each other again. Sylvester Stallone had never tried to contact him, though Frank occasionally saw the actor's name in the entertainment magazines that customers left behind. Stallone's career had flourished after Vincent's network collapsed, as if exposing the corruption had freed him to become the artist he'd always intended to be. Frank felt no resentment about this. If anything, he experienced something that might have been gratitude. Stallone's measured response to his humiliation had set everything in motion: the investigation, the revelations, the eventual destruction of a system that had poisoned everyone it touched. The afternoon heat was beginning to build when Frank finished the Honda repair. The young woman paid in cash, counting out worn bills with the careful attention of someone who knew the value of money. As her car pulled away, running smoothly for the first time in months, Frank felt the quiet satisfaction of a job completed honestly. He closed the shop early that day, as he often did, and walked to the small cemetery on the town's eastern edge. Not to visit any particular grave, but to sit on the stone bench beneath the lone cottonwood tree and watch the sun set over the mountains. It was a ritual that centered him, reminded him that time passed regardless of human schemes and betrayals. In Hollywood, Frank had never watched sunsets. There had always been another meeting, another deal, another opportunity to destroy someone who had disappointed him. Now, in the vast silence of the desert, he understood what he had been too busy to learn in 60 years of living, that peace was not the absence of conflict, but the presence of acceptance. Frank Marchetti died 3 years later, quietly and alone, of a heart attack while working beneath a broken-down Chevrolet. The town buried him in their small cemetery, and no one who attended the modest service knew they were mourning one of Hollywood's most feared producers. They knew only Frank Martinez, the soft-spoken mechanic who fixed their cars fairly and never asked questions about where they'd been or where they were going. It was exactly the ending he had never known he wanted.